Watch a film, like we watch films that we can't watch on television. That's another constraint. We're back on, yeah, okay. We watch stuff like Not a Love Story, Why Men Rape, a lot of films that we can't broadcast. And every time we did, actually for people at home, we're talking about males in the women's studies course at the moment. Anytime we showed something that showed males in a bad light, they wanted to give their experience and their reaction because they felt very badly about it. And I think their voice was very important. But as you rightly note about, gosh, I forget his name right now. I had his name in my... Eduardo, yeah. As you said about Eduardo, I mean, males just feel more comfortable talking no matter what the situation. So he tends to express himself more than the others, but less than he probably would if there wasn't the camera, because I think that intimidates everybody.
I like the Grey book. I mean, it has difficult, there are problems with it, but I like it because it is extreme in the sense that
yes, it is. Yeah.
She's a visionary, she's an ideas person, and she makes leaps that maybe if you examine them very carefully, they're not logical or they're not set down in the correct form.
Yeah.
But I think they're very dynamic.
Well, so do I. I mean, that's why I chose the text.
Yeah. And it's exciting. I think it's very readable for people just exposing themselves to.
Yeah, yeah. I think she's a very vibrant woman. She was here last year, and the reason she came, she's a futurist, and futurists are sort of a weird breed in and of themselves. They're people who, they're kind of, well, sometimes they give utopian visions and sometimes dystopic visions. Dystopic visions means a vision of the future that's horrid, like 1984. But they're always thinking about the future, and you can tell that with her book. I mean, she's looking at the society as it is, but her whole the purpose of the book is so that we can reconceptualize and have a better future. So her whole focus, and she writes on a number of things. She doesn't just write. She writes on the environment. She's got a book called Green Paradise Lost. She writes a lot of stuff. But she wrote to me because we were using the text and said she'd like to come up here and meet the Canadians who were using her text, because she's from Boston. And she came up, and she's a wonderful woman. And she was quite warm and said, if anybody from Mount St. Vincent ever goes to Boston, give her a ring, and she'd be glad to meet you. So she's a real, and I think that comes through in the book, the warmth and the caring and the concern of that woman. That's a really lively book. Again, she takes flight, and sometimes it's a bit way out, but she's a really delightful woman. I think that shines through. I mean, her use of cartoons throughout the thing, I thought was wonderful. I mean, some of those cartoons are beautiful. They're great, Okay, I think I do want to try to finish this, because I think we've pretty well milked Dodson Grey. But I do want to finish the last stuff that she has to say. Okay, and we're basically there. Okay, I started last day, and that was basically where I picked up today, saying those myths she had. Myths that she thinks are part of our patriarchal conceptual trap. And we went through myth 1 and myth 2. Now, myth 3 is the myth that all nature is feminine. And again, I'm not sure that she expresses this, all of the, I've said over and over again, that she hits every debate, but she doesn't always deal with all of the complex issues in that debate. I mean, other people have argued that our patriarchal worldview makes a division between what is mind and what is body. And what is body tends to be devalued, and what is mind tends to be valued. What is body tends to be associated with nature, and women tend to get associated with body and with nature. and what is mine tends to get associated with males and rationality. And in fact, in many of the world religions, there tends to be a rejection of the body, a loathing of the body, an attempt to deny the body, and a lot of religious rituals revolve around this notion that the body is bad and one should deny the body, and one should live in the spirit. Now, a lot of feminists think that this is not only denigrating to women, but denigrating to our actual life. And that what we have to do with our religious beliefs and with our scientific explanations is realize that we are bodily. Our minds exist in a corporeal state, and that has to be valued, right? So part of the debate that she's talking about is that kind of debate. And in fact, some religious feminists have argued that Christianity is woman-loathing because it's body-loathing, and women are seen as embodiment and temptation. And man is seen as a spiritual creature that through an exercise of mental discipline can deny the temptation that is body and the temptation that is woman. So that's all part of this issue that she doesn't get into. But if you want to read it, there's a lot written on this stuff. Okay. She talks about nature being identified as female, which it certainly is, and we don't have any difficulty thinking of examples. I was in the Netherlands in the summer giving a paper, and a European gentleman gave the keynote address, and part of the problem was translation, I guess, but I don't think it was. I mean, he imaged the world the way we image the world, and the Earth being female. And he said, I just about died. He said, you know, we are destroying Mother Nature. Of course, it was Mother Nature. And then he wanted to carry on his imagery, so he said, it is like we're biting the breast of Mother Nature. And I just sort of, you know, but even someone translating from, he was German, and he was translating in English, he had that, it's a universal imaging of the Earth as female, and its male is other than that. A woman is identified with the Earth, but male is somehow altogether other. And we can think of many examples. Mother Nature can be benevolent and fruitful, or Mother Nature can be punishing and punitive. You can't trick Mother Nature, as the De Montiads tell us. Now, many feminists, well, I already said that. You see what happens? I lose track of my notes when I'm not standing behind that strange thing. Okay. Now, Grey argues that thinking of the Earth as female serves a number of functions in our society. First, it allows us to feel that our environment is caring and nurturing. If we thought our environment, and it isn't, it's just nature. I mean, if our environment is caring and benevolent, we think that there's a purpose to all life, and we feel secure and stable. Human beings have a real need to feel that the world is ordered. They don't want to think that there isn't some ultimate purpose in things. And so they try to image the world in a way that is comforting. And that's one of the purposes that she feels thinking of Mother Nature as Mother Nature serves. Now, secondly, and more dangerously, she says, our illusions about feminized nature serve to legitimate the exploitation of nature by a male-dominated culture. She argues that we cannot separate, and this is a further argument, we cannot separate the rape of the Earth from violent sexual assault against women. She says this kind of imagery carries over into how males treat female human beings. It not only tells men what they can do with the Earth, it tells them what they can do with that which they identify with the Earth, namely, and other for all the natural world, namely women. Okay, the only thing I want to do now, I think I'm going to skip this stuff because I think you have a pretty good understanding of what Gray's all about. I want to talk about the 5 assumptions that she lists at the first of the book, because I don't think you understand what she's talking about when she lists those assumptions prior to you reading the text. And I just want to see if you've got it, because those assumptions are the major assumptions we have about our world and how it operates. And she's tried to And the task of reconceptualizing, in some ways, it might make more sense if the task of reconceptualizing, it's on page 14 if you want to look at it, might be more appropriately placed at the last page of this book. Because she has told you all the different kinds of instances of conceptual traps and patriarchal ordering of reality. And now she gives you what she thinks the major assumptions we have about the world and how it operates. And she says it's a major mission of, one assumption is that a major mission of humanity on Earth is to conquer nature. And of course, she's given us the indications that we believe that with our science, we believe it with our technology. I mean, that's still used in the space, the talk you get out of the U.S. space mission. I mean, they talk about conquering the universe, conquering outer space. I mean, they still talk in that combative kind of language. And we also see how this comes to us from our religious views and how we think about how we use language generally. Okay, the next assumption, she says, is the best, if not the only road to social progress lies in the continuous expansion of the gross output of material goods and services on a national and global basis. She says part of our worldview is that we believe growth is always good. And what is happening is we don't think that sometimes growth causes pollution. Sometimes it causes cities that have demographic problems because you built so fast that you didn't plan for all the influx of the people, and so they don't have a decent quality of life in that city. That to think that growth is always good, and we use growth as if it was always a positive word. I mean, when we're talking about ourselves and we want to change, we talk about personal growth. We use the word as somehow always a positive kind of thing, and she said we have to rethink that. Because part of that kind of assumption is that we don't plan to be conservative about what we do with our nature, with our natural world. Cooperate. Take the time to plan cities such that some people won't live in luxury and other people be hurt. And she said, we don't do that. We have this assumption that growth is good. The more growth, the better. Another assumption, she says, is that sooner or later science will provide solutions for social problems. And we've seen that. We have a faith, and it's not necessarily a reasoned faith. We have just a faith, and faith is, by definition, something that we don't necessarily have reasons, or that we definitely don't have reasons for. An act of faith is something that we just believe. We have faith in scientific methodology, despite the fact that scientific methodology and technological progress, so-called, has left us over and over again with problems that we didn't have solutions for, whether they're pollution problems or problems of the day-to-day threat of nuclear war. Science has not always given us solutions, but we have a fairly unreasonable and unthinking faith that science will solve the problems it creates. Okay, she says, and this is just a related assumption that I think from what I said is clear, that accumulating knowledge from application of the scientific method and the rule of reason will abolish emotion and superstition from the political process. And that what she's arguing there is that it is assumed, one assumption is, that emotion and rationality are oppositional. They're at war, as it were. And emotion will be eliminated as part of our decision-making process when we accumulate more reason and more knowledge according to scientific procedures. And this is another assumption. All these assumptions, she says, we have to give up if we're going to reconceptualize the world in a more humane, egalitarian, and caring place. Caring not just for women, but for all oppressed peoples. Another assumption is, because of male superiority, societies are naturally organized along patriarchal lines. And of course, this is the stuff that we kept talking about as biology is destiny. The argument that because it's this way, because every culture we look at orders itself this way, this is the way it should be. This is the way it ought to be. This is the way it has to be. And we talked about the fallacy of saying what is ought to be the case, because what is often shouldn't be the case. I mean, if we thought what is should be the case, we'd say murder is okay, because murder occurs. But things that happen we can condemn. And patriarchy exists cross-culturally, but we might say, but that doesn't mean it's justifiable. Okay, and this assumption is less clear because it's a much more complicated one, and she doesn't give thorough argumentation for accepting this. She just implies throughout the book why you should accept this belief. And the assumption is the main business in international relations is the manipulation of military-based power in support of inherently conflicting national interests, especially of those of the great powers. And she said, we operate in a world, the assumption means something like, we operate in a world where it's assumed that we can't cooperate. It's like a big marketplace where you're going to be deceptive in business negotiations because you can never trust the other guy. And that assumption, she argues, has to go if we're going to have a better, more cooperative and peaceful world. Okay, with that, I would like to finish Dodson Grey. Does anybody have any comments or questions before we get on to the other stuff? Any lingering confusion or anything that you'd like to say about it?
Our midterm be due? I noticed this not. But when will it be, the midterm on this book?
Okay, I will hand out the midterm the Thursday before reading week begins, whatever that date is. I think reading week begins on the 24th of February, so whatever the Thursday is before that. It will be due the Thursday of the week that classes begin again. So you'll have 2 weeks to do it. It doesn't take 2 weeks, but you'll have 2 weeks, and that allows people to do their. This is supposed to be a study break, but I know for a lot of people it's a skiing break. So, given that that's the case, I'm giving you 2 weeks. Okay? All right. What I want to start talking about. It reads as a very complex article. But the things that we're interested in that article aren't that complex. This is the first article in the first readings you had in the Zach and Moots book. And it's the article by Susan Baker, which you should have read by now because we're running late in terms of what I told you to read this for last Thursday. So by now you should have this stuff read. And the article is entitled Biological Influences on Human Sex and Gender. Okay, this is the material that I hoped originally when we thought we had the textbook, or expected to get the textbook, that we'd start the course with, because this whole section of this book deals with the nature-nurture debate. And over again I've told you why this is an important debate, because just like the measuring of the brain stuff, the attempt has been over and over again to show that because of their biology, because of their nature, women should be treated differently. They were biologically inferior to males. And what Baker is doing is looking at the she's looking at studies in endocrinology that followed some people either with natural genetic disorders or whose mothers took certain steroids during pregnancy that resulted in these children, their physiology, their morphology, their physical appearance to be different than their sex chromosomes indicated. So you could have an XY boy who looked like a female. And the purposes of following these children from birth was to see what effect learning had on their development of their gender identity and their sexual behavior and their sexual orientation, and if their behavior indicated some difference or similarity to kids that didn't have these problems. Okay, so that's the whole purpose of the literature that she surveys, to see if we can learn anything, because the problem we have, you never get a human being to study who has not had both biological influences, because that's built into your body, and environmental influences on molding them. So the debate is, what effect does the environment have, and what effect does the biological determining factors have, the heredity have? And it's it's maybe theoretically impossible to ever answer that definitively, but we can get more or less answers. And the impact of this is how, if you assume that a lot of what we think about ourselves as male or female has to do with how we are brought up, and we don't think how people are brought up is necessarily to their best advantage, then we can change it. Or if we think it is to their best advantage, then we can reinforce it. So that's what the debate is about. Okay. Now basically what she's doing is she's giving a review of the main studies. There haven't been a lot of studies for a good reason. You cannot experiment with hormone therapy on babies, thankfully enough. And so consequently, the only subjects they've had to study are kids that had genetic disorders, or like Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome, they call them XO babies. But in fact, remember I told you that it's the 23rd pair of chromosomes that are the sex chromosomes in human beings. And if you are an XY baby, you are chromosomally male. If you are an XX baby, then you're chromosomally female. And these children, they are missing one of the last, it's not that they're XO, that there is something there, the O. The O indicates a missing sex chromosome. So these kids don't have the extra one of the pair of sex chromosomes. And what they do is they look like females. Because, some people talk about, and I think it's confusing language to people, they talk about the female sex as the primary sex. What they mean by that is that if no androgen is introduced into the womb, everybody would look like females. It takes something extra to make a male. So in about the 6th week in the fetus, there's a high level of androgen that's introduced into the womb, and that starts the development of a penis and a scrotum. And if that is absent, or if there are receptive cells that have to receive that, if there is a lack of a receptive cell, then that child, even if it's an XY baby, will look like a female.
So does that mean when the baby's conceived, it's female?
Well, no, it's going to be an XY. It's the male adds. If actually women could give birth without males, without intercourse, they would always have female children. A male adds either the X or the Y chromosome. So the child is chromosomally either male or female at conception. What happens is that if androgen isn't introduced in the womb, they will develop what looks like a vagina. It's only with the introduction of androgen that babies start out, fetuses start out with the same tissue, the same kind of basic tissue that either develops into a vagina or into testes. And if there's not androgen or not sufficient androgen, they develop like females. Now they may be chromosomally males, but they'll look like females.
So then they could make males by just introducing the androgen into the baby?
Well, no, you see, they can't. That's the problem, you see. And there are kids born like this. They can't make them. Actually, their internal organs will not be male organs. But what happens is there are some kids who had androgen introduced. There are female kids who had androgen introduced in the womb during pregnancy, and these kids look physically. They call it sometimes. The one condition is, and this is listed in your text, called CAH. Girls, they are born with what's sometimes called ambiguous genitalia. They look more like males sometimes than they do like females, and that's the consequence of androgen being introduced in the womb. Now they're girls, chromosomally. They don't produce sperm. They don't produce semen. But, and this is one of the reasons we study these people, because sometimes mistakenly these children are raised as boys, because at birth they look like males. And some CAH girls, and this is reported in this survey of this literature, were mistakenly identified as boys and raised as boys. Now the interesting thing they found is their gender identity was male, even though they were little girls. There were two sets of kids that were studied with CAH, and that's I better get the exact wording of what that stands for. It's not particularly important to you. I think it's cortisol adrenal hyperplasia, but anyway, it's listed in your text. You can look it up. anyway, some of these girls had they were identified as females with ambiguous genitalia. They had surgery to correct the problem, and they were raised as little girls. Some were misidentified as males, and they were raised as little boys. Now, the interesting thing is the people who studied them, and these studies are continually going on and still going on at John Hopkins University. The boys, one of the things that we develop within about the first 2 years of development is a sense of who we are as female or male. Like if somebody asked you now, who are you? They were doing some kind of reflective exercise with you, and they said, who are you? You might first say your name. And they say, yeah, but who are you? You might say, oh, I'm a mother, or I'm a student, or I'm, you know, whatever you care about. And if they asked you again, at some point you'd say, well, I'm a woman. Some part of how you feel, your personal identity, is linked with your gender identity. And your gender identity, the gender identity of these kids, the ones who were raised as females, had a female gender identity. The ones that were raised as males had a male gender identity, even though all of them were chromosomally girls. And what it tells us is that there may be, it seems to be some suggestive evidence that gender identity is not a consequence of our biology, it's a consequence of what we're told. And this has been one of the big debates. And what, in fact, Money, Earhart, Epstein, all these people who have been studying this found, they tried to, when they found out that these kids were, their sex chromosomes indicated they were girls and not boys, they tried to change their gender identity. They thought, well, what we'll do with these kids, they were misidentified, we'll change them now and we'll tell them they're girls and we'll give them surgery to correct their genitalia. They found that was so traumatic to kids, even 18 months old, but definitely by 2 years of age, that if they tried to then change their gender identity, it was better to try to give them sex therapy to develop so they looked more physiologically like males than to change their gender identity to females. In fact, it precipitated emotional disturbance bordering on psychosis in some of these kids. To try to change them from thinking that they were males to thinking they were females messed them up psychologically so much that it was better to let them grow up as males, even though they would never have functioning penis because they didn't produce semen because they weren't really males, so they don't have the internal reproductive organs of males. So that tells us something very interesting about gender identity that previously we hadn't known.
So this happened at like what age? 18 months to 2 years?
Between then, they started identifying that they'd misidentified these kids. They were looking at these kids and they said, you made a mistake. These are not male children. These are CAH girls. And so with them, they tried to reteach them, teach them that they were female. And it caused such trauma that they realized that gender identity, the internalization of gender identity happens just, by the time you are 2 years old, that's why it's called the terrible twos. You say no, no matter what, your mother says, do they, and they go, no. That's when kids start, and what that no suggests is they know they're an autonomous self. They know they're not an extension of their parents, they're a different person and they can say no. As part of that differentiation that happens at that period, they internalize also a gender identity. And that becomes part of how they feel about who they are. And to subsequently try to change them causes a breakdown in personality.
I'm wondering also, I'm sure that that's the case, that kids have that identity already. But also, when you think about the influence of parents' reactions and other people, the ambivalence of a parent who finds out that their girl is a boy or vice versa, how do they react? I'm sure that they go through a tremendous amount of confusing information loading
and
into
that's,
the kid.
that's one of the problems with all of the literature you're going to study in Baker. Especially, there are 2 studies listed that deal with parents taking, in one case it was women who had a high miscarriage rate taking synthetic steroids to prevent miscarriage. Talk about what Gray says about trusting in science. Why anyone would believe that taking steroids wouldn't have an impact on a fetus seems beyond me. But anyway, these parents, because, it's the same as DES babies, right? These people took steroids to prevent miscarriages. In another case, it was, I forget what caused it. Oh yeah, it was also taking steroids as a consequence of taking a complicated drug, diethylbestrose and progesterone among diabetic women. Both cases, they produced these kind of kids. They didn't have a genetic problem. And from the minute these kids were born, the scientists knew and the parents knew that these were different kinds of kids. They knew, and so, you know, some of the results of you know, androgens are the term that's generally given to male hormones. And they studied a number of what they called androgenized females. And they studied them from birth. And lo and behold, they found that they were more tomboyish, that they were more active, and they generally concluded that they were more male. How can one look at that data and accept the conclusion without raising the question that you just did? I mean, if I had a kid that was an androgenized female, I might be worried about what kind of life they were going to have as an adult. I might reinforce more independent behavior, more so-called male-identified behavior, because a lot of them went. It said they had a delayed desire. Although they were mostly, except for one, heterosexual in gender or in sex orientation, sexual orientation. They had a longer period before they were interested in the opposite sex. And they were more interested in careers and in study and that sort of thing. Now, I am not sure I wouldn't reinforce a child for pursuing a career if I thought it less likely that they could be happily married. And no matter how stereotypical I was, if I thought my kid was going to be different and not like other young women and consequently have a hard time, I might reinforce other kinds of traits that might make her life a better life. So when they saw this so-called dominant, aggressive, competitive behavior in these androgenized females, they assumed that it was a consequence of the androgen that was introduced in the womb. The problem is, again, with all studies where it's environment and biology we're looking at, there might have been an expectation on the part of both the scientists studying these kids. They were probably looking for different behavior. They were expecting to find differences. Otherwise, they wouldn't have chosen this as a subject to look at. They thought this was anomalous. They thought it was something interesting to study. They thought it was going to tell them some information about normal development. So obviously, they were very tuned in to looking for differences. The other thing is, of course, the expectation of parents. If you're set up to think that something unusual is going to happen, you're probably going to observe something unusual. So although it's very interesting, I think the most conclusive stuff that we can get from these studies is the stuff about gender identity. That seemed to be definitely the case. Because if anything, given that there was some problem, an expectation of difference on the part of the parents, you might think they'd come out with ambivalent gender identities. If the parents expected them to be different, they might be giving them mixed messages about their gender identity. That's not what happened. These kids had clear gender identities, and the clear gender identity was how they were identified by their parents and by the scientists and how they were brought up. So that seems to be the safest conclusion, that definitely what we think we are, male or female, comes as a consequence of what we're told we are. Now that isn't, that doesn't explain transsexuals. Because transsexuals are those people who have surgery because they feel like they're inhabiting a body of the wrong gender. I mean, one of the most interesting books to read, and I think it's a very sad one, given the explanations he gave of why he had to change his gender, was written by James Morris. And some of you have heard of Edmund Hillary climbing Mount Everest. Well, the photographer that went with him was named James Morris. And James Morris wrote a book called Conundrum. And he said in it that from the time he was 3 years old, he remembers sitting under his mother's piano listening to her play Sibelius and thinking that he wanted to cry. He was so moved, but knowing he couldn't because he was a little boy. Which tells you something. I mean, that's what's tragic. Throughout the book, you realize that he changed his sex because he thought that there were certain things appropriate to males and females. But anyway, he says that his whole life experience felt like he was inhabiting the wrong body. And so he did all these macho things. He was a professional photographer, and he climbed mountains, and he did all these macho things. And he got married, and he had 3 kids. And then he had a sex change. And now you can read James Morris's writings in Rolling Stones, and he writes quite frequently in Rolling Stone, in many contemporary magazines, and his name is now Jan Morris, or her name is now Jan Morris. So it doesn't explain if gender identity, well, it could explain it. I mean, if gender identity comes out in some way ambivalent or cross-gender, again, it may not be, that may be accountable in terms of he maybe have gotten mixed messages, weird messages, or funny messages when he was growing up. But he definitely felt alienated from his own body. And rather than, he said for years and years he went through psychotherapy trying to change his head around, and then realized it was much easier to change his body. So he did that. Any questions about this stuff?
How prevalent is that sort of?
That's the other thing that should be noted about reading this literature. We're talking and generating any kind of general beliefs or conclusions about this. Very rare. Luckily, because I think it's very difficult on both the people that have this happen to them and the parents, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with. Sometimes less than others. I mean, it's depending on how it's handled. But it is, I mean, in one case, he's talking about the sample that, not he, but Susan Baker is reporting. I say he because one of the prime movers in all this research is James Money, and James Money has written numerous books on sex role identity, gender identity, sex role behaviors. He's got one called something like Woman, Man. He's written numerous books and numerous studies, so he's most famous and most often linked with this research at Johns Hopkins. He may be the leader of the research group that does this. At one point, anyway, his sample is 10 people. So to try to come up with any conclusions, and he has some larger samples. I mean, at one study, I think I remember reading there were 131 subjects. But when you look at the whole population of the world and you think you've got 131 subjects to try to find something else out about, you got to be very, very cautious about what you think it implies. And the problem is what I mentioned initially. I mean, you just can't start messing about with people's hormones you can't do experimental research. The only thing you can do is look at the subjects that either naturally arise because of genetic problems or endogenous problems, or you can find, and hopefully there won't be too many in future, people that were problems of being given certain kinds of, their mother taking certain kinds of chemicals while they were steroids while they were pregnant. Yeah.
It just occurred to me, I mean, this is all also in a Western context. I mean, I'm curious about, we have no idea what untampered with people who obviously, or I would say presumably, these kinds of chromosomal differences happen outside of North America. They happen in other cultures where they don't have scientists digging them out and investigating them. I mean,
Well, they did have one, but they've all gone down to study them. There's some culture, and boy, I can't remember the island. I'll see if I can remember. I'll look at the study. There is some island, and I think if I recall, one thing I recall is that it's a very macho society that this happens in. And it's an island that I believe the people speak Spanish, so it may be around South America. There's a weird genetic disease that is really prevalent in that society. A lot of members of that society carry whatever the gene is that reproduce. What happens with these people is that a certain number of men in this society don't have a high enough androgen level to form a penis and a scrotum in the womb, but when they reach puberty, all of a sudden their testicles descend, and they are raised till puberty like girls in a society that has really differentiated sex roles. So they clean house and they cook and they take care of the family, and then at 13 they all of a sudden become males, and there's a great celebration because it's a very macho society. And then they stop cleaning, and then they go fight and drink beer and whatever they do. I don't know. But they have been the subject of a lot of study by sex researchers that are interested. And I mean, people say, well, that just shows, I don't remember what they say, but I was going to say what they say. I mean, what they do say, I think that's really highly problematic to figure out what's going on there, because everybody expects it. I mean, it happens in every generation with so many families, that it's just a part of natural life. And so, you know, you may have 4 girls, and you know, chances are one of them at puberty is going to become a male.
So that rather than being freaks, they probably, it's a celebration because, hooray, another male.
Another male, yeah, it's
superior
a great
being.
thing. Another superior being. Yeah, so what, in fact, and especially given the intensive study that's gone on with this culture, I don't know what we can conclude. I mean, it's a very interesting phenomena, but I don't know what it can tell us, given that it takes place in a very macho society. It's been a part of their culture for a long time, and there are a whole bunch of people have trotted down there for the last 10 years to observe them. So, but it is interesting anyway. Okay, I think I would like you to reread, if you haven't read, Baker for, oh no, okay, I was going to tell you the wrong information. The 4th of February, next Tuesday, is when Dr. Joyce Kennedy is going to be talking to you. You've all had the handout Christian Feminism, and people at home should have received it by now. I would like you to read that for her lecture on Tuesday, and then on Thursday I will continue with this stuff. So what I'd like you to do for Thursday is read through or reread Baker, because it is sort of complex, and I haven't gone through it the way I normally do, to see if there's anything that's particularly confusing to you. There's a lot of terminology in it, like testicular feminization, androgenized females, all that kind of stuff, that if you don't know what that stuff means, come to class with questions and I'd be glad to clarify it. After that, I'm going to skip over the Freud. We talked about Freud earlier in the term. I'll review Freud a bit in the last week before the break, just to make sure that you're all clear on it. I want to talk about the Tavris and off-air stuff. And then we'll follow through after that article with the last article in that section, which is Maccabee and Jacob. Jacob? Maccabee and Jackson? Or Jacob? Anyway, it's the last article in that section. And all of that literature is the literature related to one of the 2 essay questions you have. So it's important that you get an understanding of what's going on there. And in fact, the Maccabee book is one of the best secondary sources you can look at for further information for your essay, because what they did is they did a survey of all of the findings and all of the research that anybody done on sex differences. So it's basically a summary survey of what every kind of study found, both on the learning side of it, the nurture side of it, and the biological determinism. And they show where studies aren't replicated, where they contradict each other, where they confirm each other. So it gives you a nice overview of where the research is really at. Any questions? Problems? We have 1 more minute. The only problem with this, you see, is I don't see this great response. Although I do see that people have loosened up a bit, and hopefully this is the beginning of.
With the Maccabee and Jacqueline work, now that all took place from 66 to 74, and
Yeah.
it doesn't update
No,
from
it doesn't.
74.
It's the only sort of up to that date. It's the most thorough. Nobody's done that, and nobody's done that since. I mean, there hasn't been an update from 74 to 86. No, you can get contemporary books, but nothing with like the kind of broad sweep that you get in that book. So it's pretty good for that reason. But okay, I will see you Tuesday. Have a good weekend.